In the next part of the discussion this week, we're going to talk about the social bonding theory as well as the self-control theory. The theory that we're talking about is social bonding theory, and this was formulated by Travis Hirschi when he wrote in 1969. He wrote The Causes of Delinquency. Now, this is the theory that most people think of when they think of social control and even self-control theory. But this was, as I said, originated in 1969. And he said that people don't commit crime because they are actually bonded to the conventional society. There's a metaphor that describes the difference between social control and other positive theories such as social learning. And Hirschi said, the birds of a feather flock together. And Akers has reiterated that a little bit. If you lie down with dogs, you get up with fleas. Hirschi's social control theory, and I want you to make sure you distinguish between this when you're writing anything about self-control or social control on the two differences. But the social control theory says by Hirschi that people who are alike, like if they're delinquent, they attract each other. Akers' theory is if a person hangs around with a bad crowd, then they will eventually pick up those bad behaviors. There are 4 elements to Hirschi's social control theory, and this is attachment. Close emotional ties to people we care about, admire, and model. So the more we care about someone's expectations, the more attached or bonded we are to them. The more insensitive to others, the less we are controlled by the norms and values that we share. So we're actually more likely to violate those norms. The main why internalization of values occurs is really through this attachment to others. The primary attachment that we read about and we know about are to our parents, to peers, and to school. Commitment is the extent to which individuals have an investment in the conventional society. So in other words, how much would they lose by committing a crime? This is the rational element of this theory in terms of the calculus of the loss and gain. So the amount one would lose or gain by commitment to pro-social values and behaviors. The problem here is that Hirschi didn't really consider the rewards or the cost of deviance when he was writing this. The third element in the social bond concepts is involvement. Now this is similar to commitment, but it's the amount of time a person will engage in pro-social activities. So if young people are too busy with sports or other activities, they won't have time to get into trouble. Also, these activities, they need to be important to the youth. You can't just put a youth or a juvenile into something and require they do it, because they're not going to be invested in it. So if a child is succeeding at something, let's say a sport or music, they're more likely to continue to stay involved with that activity. The final concept that the way an individual is bonded to society is through beliefs or an endorsement of the conventional values and norms. What society says I should do is the right thing to do. Social bonding theory is really one of the most tested theories out there. In fact, I actually wrote a paper on it myself. Hirschi's own testing showed a general support for the theory. The weaker the bonds, the greater the probability of delinquency. Other empirical evidence is weak to moderate. So the major problem with this theory is really that Hirschi says that if there isn't attachment, then the risk of delinquency is high. However, most research supports the idea that there actually can be weak bonds to society, but it's the strong bonds to the deviant peer group that makes delinquency more likely. So you can have weak bonds, but it's that strong bond that's really going to overtake. A few years later, Hirschi teamed up with Michael Gottfredson, and they proposed a control theory of crime that's based on one type of control, and that's self-control. And that they wrote the general theory of crime. And before I go farther into self-control, let me tell you a little bit about what they say. In pure classical theory, people committed criminal acts that had no special propensities. They merely followed the universal tendency to enhance their own pleasure. So, for policy purposes, classical theorists emphasized legal consequences. The importance to them of moral sanctions is so obvious that their theories might well be called, listen to this, undeveloped social control theories. So, as we're going to see with all the theories we talk about, they're all developed and become more specific, as well as a theory should. It should always be being revamped and looked at, and that's the same thing we're seeing here. Classical theory, as we've talked about a couple weeks ago, it's a theory of social or external control. It's really a theory based on the idea that the cost of crime will depend on the individual's current location in or bond to society. So what classical theory lacks, though, is an explicit idea of self-control. And the general theory of crime, Gottfredson and Hirschi say that their theory explains all individual differences in the propensity to refrain from or to commit crime, including all acts of crime and deviance at all ages and under all circumstances. The theory states that individuals with high self-control will be substantially less likely at any time within their life to engage in the criminal acts, whereas those that have low self-control are more likely to commit crime. They go on to say that low self-control will lead to criminal behavior when the opportunities are available and the circumstances are optimal. The indications of low self-control include impulsivity, the need for immediate gratification, high tendency to take risk, short temper, and a tendency to use the physical measures to solve problems rather than emotional or intellectual. If you like, and of course it's not required, but The General Theory of Crime is a great book, and I think you can find it used. So if you look on Amazon or any of these half.coms, or even I think usedbooks.com, you can find these used books. And The General Theory of Crime is great, and it actually goes into a lot more detail than Akers does in regards to these elements, but as it should, because that's what the book is mainly focused on. They say, Gottfredson and Hirschi, that the source of low control is effective or incomplete socialization, especially ineffective child rearing. Parents who are attached to their children supervise them closely. They recognize the lack of self-control in their children, and then they punish those acts. This will actually help children develop good social control. These children will then be less likely to engage in delinquent behaviors as teens, and even less likely to engage in crime as adults. And Gottfredson and Hirschi say that once the level of self-control is formed in childhood, it is relatively stable trait. And I think this is mentioned within many of the discussions. And I'll end this just by telling you, when I was in school studying theory of crime, there was a video that we watched. And to let you know that it's and I ask this question sometimes just to see what students will say, but how do you study the lack of self-control on deviant behavior? The only way to do it is you have to go back and find someone or parents that did not give that attachment. They're missing all of the social bonding concepts. But you can't take away attachment. There's also another good book on actually attachment theory by Bowlby that talks about that you know, it's unethical. So you can't have a control group and an experimental group where you just take away all of the bonding concepts. So, and that is really the only way to see that a child is not attached. But it is research, and like I said, if you Another study you might want to look into is Bowlby, and I'd be more than glad to put these. I'll put these within the unit.